A storm lashes the port of Aarhus. Amid the roar of the wind and torn sails, a ship with no flag docks without warning. From it descends a man everyone believed dead, and a boy with an unreadable face and wary eyes, whom no one has seen before. In the shipyard, Magda Nielsen freezes. 20 years have passed. 20 years since he promised to return. What lies behind this unexpected return? Is it fate, or a still open wound crying out for justice? Welcome to a story of restrained passions, secrets from the sea, and second chances. Write to us and let us know where you're listening from. And tell me, do you believe true love can survive abandonment and the passing of time? Aarhus, Denmark, winter of the year 1797. The dawn fog clung stubbornly to the stone pier, stretching its damp fingers through the rigging of the Nielsen shipyard. Seagulls screeched in the distance, circling above white sails barely visible through the thick mist. The scent of salt, tar, and freshly cut wood filled the air, while hammers echoed with a rhythm almost liturgical. Magda Nielsen, wrapped in her thick wool redingote and her bun tightly pinned at the nape of her neck, strode confidently across the wooden boards of the shipyard. Her dark coat, worn by years of labor and dignity, billowed behind her like the banner of an undefeated woman. Her grayish-amber eyes, rarely softened, focused on the curve of the brig's keel being restored. It was a cargo ship soon to set sail for Stockholm with barrels of oil and timber. Nothing about that morning suggested destiny was about to change its course with a single glance. "Steadier on the crossbeam, Ina," she ordered, not raising her voice, yet with an authority no man in that port dared to challenge. Then, a cry shattered the routine. "Ship in sight, no flag." The workers dropped their tools. Magda slowly turned her head toward the horizon, just as a silhouette emerged from the fog, gliding like a silent specter across the Baltic waters. A ship of noble, though aged lines approached against the wind, its sails torn, but moving as if someone or something guided it with undeniable purpose. "Dear God," muttered Klaus Mikkelsen, leaning on his carpenter's cane as he recognized the helm, that hull, that figurehead. Magda said nothing. Her breath stopped. Not from fear, but because the body always knows before the soul when life is about to split in two. The vessel docked with difficulty. None of the harbor's sailors stepped forward to tie it off. No one wanted to be the first to touch what seemed to have arrived from the other world. Then, from the main deck, descended a man with a proud stance, broad shoulders, and hair tied back in a low ponytail. His long cloak billowed around him, and his face, weathered and marked by time, held something unmistakable. He was no stranger. He couldn't be. Magda felt the ground dissolve beneath her boots. "Eric," she whispered, though her voice never left her lips. 20 years. 20 winters had passed since he left for the colonies, promising to return with riches, promises, and a future. 20 years since the last letter, the last night his shadow was cast against the light of a lantern. She had mourned his death in silence. She had buried every memory under layers of work, pride, and silence. And yet there he was, alive. But he wasn't alone. Beside him came down a young man with brown skin, a guarded expression, and eyes like extinguished embers. He had the build of a sailor, but the tense gait of someone who had known too many closed doors. He wore a frayed hat, patched trousers, and carried a sack over his shoulder. He didn't look up at anyone, except Magda, whom he glanced at for a fleeting second, distrust simmering beneath the surface. The harbor fell into reverent silence, as if even the sea held its breath. "Ghosts never come back for anything good," Klaus murmured in Magda's ear, not looking at her, as if speaking to the wind. Magda swallowed hard, forcing herself to keep her back straight. She didn't move, she didn't speak, but her hands, hidden beneath her coat, clutched tightly to the handkerchief in her pocket. She knew blood can harden over the years, but the heart remembers, and does not forgive so easily. The name Eric Dahl hung in the air like a spell. No one said it, no one dared. The man's eyes searched for Magda's, and when they finally met, no words were spoken, just a long look heavy with what wasn't said, what was lost, all that never healed. And then, as if winter itself wanted to mark the moment, it began to snow. But nothing would ever be white again. Snow was falling unhurriedly, covering the rooftops of Aarhus in a solemn shroud of silence. The bells of the Lutheran church rang faintly in the distance, marking the day's end with a deep chime that seemed to pierce through the harbor fog. At the Nielsen shipyard, tools had already been put away, and the men were leaving in silence, speaking in hushed tones about what had happened that morning. None dared to raise their voice, as if saying it aloud would make the impossible real. Magda remained in her office, standing by the window. She hadn't wanted to go home, not yet. Her fingers held a glass of warm wine, now cold, untouched. She watched the snow pile up on the shipyard planks the way one watches the passing of years. There were no tears on her face, no visible rage, only the stillness that comes when the heart refuses to accept what the eyes have already seen. A gust of wind struck the window pane. Magda barely blinked. Her silhouette, framed by the soft glow of the brazier, looked as if carved from stone. She still wore the same dark gray wool skirt from that morning, the same high-collared linen blouse, and the same wounded pride no one in Aarhus dared confront. Someone knocked at the door. It was a dry, firm knock, one of someone who does not hesitate. Magda didn't answer. The knock came again. "It's me," said a deep voice, a little wearier than before. "I just want to talk, a moment, nothing more." She closed her eyes, breathed in, and slowly turned toward the door. She didn't know why she did it. She didn't want to hear him. She didn't want apologies or explanations, least of all memories. But something in that voice, something older than pain, deeper than the wound, wouldn't let her remain still. She opened the door. There he was, standing, hat in hand, cloak covered in frost, his eyes locked on hers. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't step in. He just looked at her. "I'm not here seeking forgiveness," he said in a low voice. "It wouldn't be fair, but I also don't want silence to be the only thing left between us." Magda stepped aside with a slight tilt of her head. She didn't invite him in, but she didn't close the door either. Eric crossed the threshold with measured steps, like one stepping onto sacred ground. He stopped by the fireplace and held his hands toward the flames. "The cold of the sea never truly leaves you," he murmured. "You carry it in your bones, like certain memories." Magda turned toward him slowly. She didn't come closer. She remained standing by her desk as if that distance were a wall that needed to remain standing. "And what exactly should I remember?" she asked. "The silence, the promises you never kept?" Eric lowered his gaze. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, dark wooden box, worn by time. He set it on the desk without pushing it toward her. "This belonged to Harold," he said in a neutral tone. "He gave it to me the day I left, asked me to deliver it to you if something happened to him." Her late husband's name fell like a stone into water. Magda's brow furrowed. "Now you want to talk about him." "We were friends, Magda, before all of this. He asked me to look after you, and I failed." She didn't reply. Slowly she approached the box. She hesitated before opening it. Her fingers trembled as she lifted the lid. Inside, resting on a piece of blue cloth, was a neatly folded letter, and something else. An old silver ring, set with a sky-blue stone at its center. It was the same one Harold had bought years ago, back when they still dreamed of better times. He had kept it for the daughter they never had, or maybe as a symbol of something meant to be passed on when the time was right. Magda picked up the letter. She recognized Harold's handwriting instantly. The ink was faded, but each stroke was unmistakable. She didn't open it, not yet. "Why didn't you give this to me sooner?" she asked, without looking at him. "I was missing, imprisoned, cut off, afterwards. I didn't know if you were still alive, if you'd want to see me. I didn't even know if coming back here was the right thing." She looked at him sharply. Her eyes held no tears, but there was a biting gleam, like the edge of a blade untouched for too long. "That didn't give you the right to vanish for 20 years, she said, barely raising her voice. "Or to keep what you kept, or to show up here as if time meant nothing." Eric nodded. He didn't argue. He only lowered his head, as one who has carried guilt for far too long. A long silence settled between them. Outside the wind still blew. Inside the fire's warmth barely softened the weight of the unspoken. "That boy," Magda said at last, "is he yours?" Eric looked up. His eyes, gray like the winter sea, did not shy away from the answer. "Yes, his name is Jonas. He was born in St. Thomas." "And his mother?" He took his time replying. "She died when he was 5. Magda nodded. She said nothing more. She closed the box slowly, as if sealing away not just an object but a fragment of her soul. Then she turned to the fireplace. The fire crackled softly. "You can go now," she said, not raising her voice. Eric didn't move at first. "May I come back tomorrow?" She didn't answer. She simply stared into the flames, as if searching there for the answer she wasn't ready to speak aloud. Eric understood. He stepped back, then again, and left without fully closing the door behind him. Magda waited until she heard his footsteps fading into the snow. Only then did she allow herself to sit down. She held the box in her lap and rested her forehead against it. She didn't cry, but in her chest something stirred with an ancient force. It wasn't love, not yet. Nor was it hatred. It was memory. The kind the sea didn't take. The sun barely peeked through the thick clouds that blanketed the sky over Aarhus, casting a pale grayish glow over the port city. The Baltic wind blew steadily, lifting old snowflakes that skittered across the frozen cobblestones as if searching for a place to rest. At the shipyard, the day began with the sound of saws and hammers, but inside Magda Nielsen's house reigned an ancient silence, the kind that settles only when the past knocks at your door and demands to be heard. Seated by the window in the main parlor, with the wooden box still resting on her lap, Magda held the letter written by her late husband. She had opened it the night before, when the solitude had grown too thick to ignore. Harold's handwriting was so familiar it hurt. Every word was steeped in a tenderness that no longer existed in her life. In the letter, he spoke of his concern for her future, of his wish that she find support in the man he considered a brother in arms, Eric Dahl. But what tore her apart was the last line: "If he ever returns, if you ever see him again, tell him to keep his promise to you, because you deserve a fate without abandonment." Magda had read that line aloud again and again, her heart clenched, her lips trembling. Harold had known, he had always known. That morning the memory came back forcefully. It wasn't a thought, it was a vivid image, intact. As if time had unraveled, Magda closed her eyes and saw herself 20 years earlier, running through the rain along the pier, drenched, hair loose, feet covered in mud. Eric caught up with her, held her face in his large hands and promised he would return, not with empty words but with a man's vow, his eyes steady, his lips inches from hers. "When I come back you'll bear the name you deserve," he had said. "I swear it by this port, by this sea, and by what we share." But he hadn't returned, not then. The creaking of the front door pulled her out of the reverie. It was Klaus, the old carpenter, stepping in with heavy boots, shaking frost from his wool cap. One look was enough to understand this wasn't an ordinary day. "You read it?" he asked softly, as if afraid to disturb the heavy air that surrounded them. Magda nodded without a word. She stood slowly, set the box down on the oak table, and walked toward the coat rack. She took her long black wool cloak, lined with linen, and draped it over her shoulders. "I'm going to the shipyard," she said firmly. "Shall I go with you?" "No, this time, I need to walk alone." Klaus bowed his head. He knew when to step aside. The walk to the port wasn't far, but that morning it felt eternal. Each step through the snow seemed to carry her not just toward the shipyard, but to the very place where fate had chosen to wait for her. When she arrived, the workers' murmurs died down. All eyes turned to her, some with respect, others with curiosity, and a few with that cruel mix of judgment and morbid interest. Eric was beside the frame of an unfinished ship. His sleeves were rolled up, his shirt stained with resin, and his boots dusted with sawdust. The tied-back hair at his nape glistened with moisture. When he saw Magda, he lowered his hammer and approached her cautiously, as if afraid any word might shatter the fragile balance of something about to be born. "I want to finish that hull," she said bluntly, "but I don't want to do it alone." Eric looked at her, stunned. His chest rose with a deep breath. "You mean?" "We'll build one last ship," she interrupted, "one that bears a new name, one that won't carry ghosts." The silence between them was dense, full of unsaid words. "What will it be called?" Eric asked, his voice tight. "Freya," she answered, "like the goddess of the sea and of love, because if we're going to sail through ruins, we might as well do it with dignity." He nodded slowly. He didn't try to move closer. The distance between them was still marked by years, by silence, by wounds. "Thank you for letting me do this," he murmured. "I'm not doing it for you," Magda said, voice firm. "I'm doing it for who I was, and for what I can still build with my own hands." That same afternoon, the plans began to take shape. Magda locked herself in her office for hours, sketching every curve of the hull with mathematical precision. When Klaus entered with a bowl of hot soup, she didn't look up. She was focused, resolute. "What name will go on the mast?" he asked. "Freya," she replied without hesitation, "and it will carry my mark, not a man's." But not everyone in Aarhus was willing to accept that decision. The next day, as Magda walked through the port market looking for tempered nails and hemp cloth, a group of merchants argued loudly near the fish stall. "A woman building ships, what a farce," said one of them, a portly man named Hallberg, known for his venomous tongue. "And with help from a nameless foreigner no less," added another. "That doll doesn't have any papers. How do we even know who he really is?" "Bah," Hallberg sneered. "She just needs a man's name to keep running that shipyard, because a woman alone, no matter how good she is with a hammer, shouldn't have a business like that in her own name." The words reached Magda's ears like sharpened blades. She stopped in her tracks, the bag still in her hands, and turned slowly. "Is there something you'd like to say to me directly, Mr. Halberg?" she asked, her voice firm, tempered like steel. The man cleared his throat, lowered his eyes, and mumbled a clumsy apology. The others fell silent. Magda walked back to the shipyard with her head held high, but inside a fire burned, a mix of rage and wounded pride. That town which had sold her respect on conditions still doubted her worth. That night, back at home, she laid out the plans for the Freya on the table. She studied them for a long time. Then, without a word, she opened the drawer and pulled out the engagement ring Harold had entrusted to her. She placed it at the center of the plans, right where the keel was drawn. Eric's promise had gone unfinished. But now, at least, she would be the one to decide how it would end. With steady hands, with her own voice, and with the dignity of someone who has learned to build, even upon ruins. Frost coated the rooftops like the skin of aged silver as the port of Aarhus awoke, wrapped in a chill that pierced the bones. The air carried the heavy scent of briny sea, damp rope, and old wood. At the shipyard, work began before dawn, and in those first moments of the day, the only sound that broke the silence was the crunch of boots on hardened snow. Jonas walked steadily through the rigging of the yard, carrying a toolbox that nearly outweighed him. He was hunched from the effort, but his eyes, dark and guarded, missed nothing. He studied the movements of each carpenter, the sway of the masts, the way the ropes were tied. He wanted to learn. He didn't say it, but he showed it in every shift, working harder than anyone, speaking less than all. The men of the harbor watched him with suspicion, not because of his silence nor his age, but because of his skin, the curly hair barely tamed beneath his cap, his soft accent when he spoke Danish, and above all because he wasn't one of them. "That boy's not from good blood," muttered one laborer while sharpening a chisel. "They say he was born on a plantation," added another, leaning against a barrel of tar. "A mulatto, and a bastard, no doubt." "And with those eyes," said a third, "you never know if he's about to smile or pull a knife." The words weren't spoken loudly, but their venom was thick enough to sour the air like sea mist. Jonas pretended not to hear, but he heard them. He heard everyone. That afternoon, while helping align an axle along the keel of the new ship, one of the apprentices, a pale, smirking boy named Frederick, dropped a sack of wood shavings in front of him and muttered with a sneer. "They say those born in hot lands have burning hearts, but not for working, only for stealing or killing." Jonas looked up, his hands clenched into fists, but he said nothing. He simply picked up the sack and carried on. The jeer didn't stop. "Did your mother teach you to keep quiet, or did you just not know who she was?" That's when Klaus Mikkelson's gravelly voice rang out, sharp and loud. "Enough." The old carpenter had worked in silence all morning with his usual precision, but now his small, piercing blue eyes fixed on Frederick like blades. "If you've got a mouth, boy, you'd better learn when to shut it," he said. "And you, brat, can't even measure a mast properly, so don't go trying to measure anyone's blood." Frederick lowered his head, but not without throwing Jonas a last look of disdain. Jonas didn't flinch. From the workshop doorway, Magda had seen everything. Hidden in the shadowed threshold, she watched the scene unfold, her lips tight, her brow furrowed. It wasn't the first time she'd heard the rumors. But that morning, something in Jonas's stance, in the way he held himself back, stirred in her a feeling she knew all too well, that blend of pride and vulnerability born in those who've learned to endure everything without breaking. The boy didn't complain. He didn't ask for help. He simply continued working, his focus bordering on defiance. That evening, after the yard had closed, Jonas didn't return with Eric. He walked alone to the main pier, where the sea lapped slowly against the stone pillars. The sky was blanketed in leaden clouds, and the wind whirled loose flakes across the dock. He sat at the edge, legs dangling over the freezing water, staring at the horizon where the sea dissolved into fog. He didn't hear the approaching footsteps until Magda spoke. "This is where I used to come, when I needed to remember the world was bigger than my sorrow." Jonas didn't startle. He turned his head slightly and looked at her, then turned back to the sea. "Does it work?" he asked. "Sometimes," she answered honestly. "Other times, the sea just throws back what you want to forget." She sat beside him, not imposing closeness, but not insisting on distance either. Silence stretched between them like a bridge built without words. "You don't have to tell me anything," she said after a while, "but if you ever want to talk, I'm here." Jonas took a deep breath. The moisture in the air clung to his face like invisible tears. Her name was Naomi, he said at last, not looking at her. She was strong, had rough hands and a soft voice. She used to say I was a child of the sea because I was born during a storm, but I don't remember her voice, not really. Magda listened, her chest tight. She died when I was 5, a fever, in St. Thomas. I was left alone, and then he showed up. He didn't need to say the name. He took me with him, taught me how to sail, how to count the stars, how to read the wind, but he paused, a brief, painful silence, never talks about her, like she never existed. Maybe, Magda whispered, he remembers her so much that saying her name would break him. Jonas said nothing. The wind picked up, the sails of moored ships groaned in the distance. I don't want pity, he said suddenly, or explanations. I just want to understand why I exist in halves, why parts of my story are made of silence. Magda looked at him then, for the first time, as one looks at a son who doesn't yet know that's what he is. No one exists in halves, Jonas, but sometimes there are people who make us feel like we do, because they don't know how to love what they don't understand. He looked at her. His eyes were moist, but he didn't cry. There was an untamed dignity in his face, forged in absence, tempered at sea. Thank you for not asking more, he murmured. Thank you for trusting me, she replied. And there, seated before the cold northern waters, under a sky that seemed to want to cry for those who couldn't, a bond was formed, one that needed no blood to be real. A bond made of respect, of shared pain, and of silences that at last had begun to break. The afternoon darkened with unusual haste. The clouds pressed down on the sky above Aarhus like a foreboding weight, and the air grew dense, charged with restrained electricity. The creaking of sails tied to masts warned that the wind was coming in fury, and sailors in the port began to hurry, closing shutters, securing vessels, and throwing tarps over their cargo. At the Nielsen shipyard, the Freya stood tall like a suspended promise. Its keel, still bare, cut across the ashen sky. Magda stood over the plans laid out on a wooden table beneath a taut canvas awning that already threatened to take flight. Her skirt clung to her boots from the damp, and her hair, pinned tightly earlier, had begun to unravel in strands the wind tossed across her face. Klaus, on the other side of the workshop, had already given the order to evacuate. The apprentices ran about with ropes and covers, trying to protect what mattered most. But she didn't move, not while one crossbeam remained unsecured, not while the tools were still exposed, not while Freya depended on her resolve. You need to get out of here, said Eric, appearing behind her with a firm voice, soaked through to the shoulders. Magda turned slowly. She saw him standing there, shirt clinging to his chest from the rain, hair dripping water, his eyes burning with urgency. The north side isn't secured, she replied, unmoving. If we leave it, the wind will tear it to pieces. I know, he answered. That's why I'm here, to help. There was no time for unnecessary words. They exchanged a brief glance, as if both understood that in that moment, duty was the only language that mattered. For hours they fought the wind, the rain, the cold that seeped deep into their bones. Magda drove nails with the strength of someone who's learned never to give in. Eric tightened ropes, held up beams, shouted orders swallowed by thunder. Night fell without their notice. Only when hail began to strike the ground like shrapnel did they realize they could no longer continue. To the shed, he shouted, grabbing her arm. Magda didn't argue. They ran together through puddles and mud to the old wooden structure where they kept the old blueprints and most delicate tools. Once inside, Eric shut the door with effort and bolted it from within. The light was dim, just a single lantern hung on the wall, flickering weakly. They were both soaked. Water dripped from their clothes, forming puddles on the wooden floor. Magda leaned against the wall, breathing heavily. Eric stood a meter away, not touching her, but not retreating either. Silence reigned. Only the roar of the storm outside and the intermittent drip of water falling from their bodies could be heard. Do you remember the last time we were in here? He asked, his voice hoarse. Magda raised her eyes. She didn't have to think. She remembered with painful clarity. It was the day before you left, she said. Eric nodded. He stepped closer, slowly, not imposing, not invading. I didn't want to leave, he said, but I didn't want to stay and be less than what you deserved either. And yet you left, she replied coldly, though her voice trembled, and you never came back. Coming back was impossible, he said. I was captured. The ship was taken by corsairs. I was sold into forced labor in the colonies. I spent years without a name, without a homeland, without a course. Magda looked at him, unsure whether his words were truth or invention, but in his eyes there was something she hadn't seen before. Pain, yes, but also a weariness that couldn't be faked. "Why didn't you write?" she asked. "Not one line, not a single sign you were alive." Eric ran his hand over his face, dragging rain and desperation along with it. "Because there was no paper, no ink, no free hands, and when I finally escaped, so many years had passed that I didn't know if I had the right to return. I feared finding you married, I feared finding you dead." "So you chose not to know," she murmured. "That too is a choice." He didn't respond right away. He stepped a bit closer. The lantern cast their shadows on the wall, long and distorted, like the memories surrounding them. "I wasn't brave, Magda. I was a coward, but I was also a slave, to men, to guilt, and to my own silence." She closed her eyes for a moment. His words fell over her chest like the cold water of the storm. When she opened them again, she looked at him with a mix of anger and tenderness, of need and fear. "You kissed me here for the first time," she whispered. "Here you swore you'd return and give me your name. Do you remember that?" "I remember it every day," he said. "It was the only thing that kept me going when everything else was gone." Magda took a step back. The wood creaked beneath her boots. Her heart pounded in her chest with a force she hadn't felt in years. "I don't know if I can believe you," she said at last. "Not yet, not after everything I lost." Eric nodded. He didn't beg, he didn't plead, he simply lowered his head as if accepting the price of his choices. "I didn't come asking you to believe me," he murmured. "I came to build something new, and if you'll let me stay near, even just as another laborer, I'll be wherever you ask." Silence returned, but it was no longer hostile. It was the silence of two souls who recognized each other as wounded but not defeated. Outside, the storm began to wane. Inside, the shed held the warmth of something older than resentment. Magda sat on a workbench, exhausted. Eric remained standing a few steps away, his eyes on the floor. They didn't touch, they didn't embrace, but in the stillness they shared that endless night, something began to break, not as ruin but as opening. Because sometimes the first step toward forgiveness isn't a word. It's staying, when walking away would be easier. Morning broke with a muted light, filtered through window panes coated in frost. Inside the shipyard, there was a strange kind of silence, different from the usual one. The men worked at their stations, yes, but there was a charged stillness in the air, as if everyone were waiting for the outcome of something they couldn't yet name. On the Freya's keel, the ice from the night before melted slowly, the droplets hitting the ground like a slow, mournful weeping. Jonas was carrying an empty wooden crate to the back of the workshop. He wore a thick shirt patched at the elbows, and a dark leather vest already warped from use. Though his steps were steady, his mind was far from the tools and planks. The storm from days earlier had left more than dampness behind. It had sown silences between his father and Magda, silences he didn't know how to interpret. At the small storage room in the back of the yard, he searched the shelves for a set of forged nails. As he moved an old canvas to reach a deeper box, his hand bumped against a bundle tied with thick cord. It was dusty and encased in a leather pouch hardened by time. Curious, he pulled it out. It bore no markings, but when he untied it, he found inside a dozen letters. All were addressed to the same name, Magda Nielsen. His heart skipped a beat. The handwriting was unmistakable. There was no doubt. They were from his father. Some were dated over 10 years ago, others were more recent. None had been opened. Jonas stood still for a moment. Then, with trembling hands, he pulled out one of the sheets and began to read. The words struck him like waves in the midst of a storm. In them his father spoke with a kind of honesty Jonas had never heard from him before. He wrote of his pain, his uncertainty, his longing to return, his regret for every day of silence. These weren't letters from a proud man, but from a broken one, and in each paragraph echoed the sound of a shattered promise of a love suspended in time. One letter, its ink blurred by water, described the day Eric thought he had seen Magda in a port in Marseille. It was another woman, he wrote. But the way her hair moved when she walked made my heart race like it did when I was 20, and in that moment I knew I had never gone a single day without thinking of you. Jonas closed his eyes. For the first time he understood that his father wasn't just a sailor hardened by life, but a man marked by loss, guilt, and love. But he also realized something else. Those letters had never reached their destination. What lay between Eric and Magda wasn't just an open wound, it was a wound that might have healed, had these words found their way home. He packed the letters back in silence. He told no one. He waited until dusk when the shipyard was empty and the port's mist began to turn the shadows gray. Then he climbed up to Magda's house, crossed the threshold without announcing himself, and found her seated by the fire, the Freya's plans spread across the table. She looked at him with a mix of surprise and calm. Jonas said nothing. He walked up to her and set the bundle on the table in front of her. Then, without a word, he turned on his heels and left. Magda remained still for several seconds. Then, with trembling fingers, she untied the string. At the sight of the envelopes, she recognized Eric's handwriting instantly. Her breath caught in her throat. She hesitated for a moment before opening the first letter. Her reading was slow, painful. Each word was like an unexpected return. As she read, her lips trembled and her gaze took on a dull shimmer. The look of someone holding back tears with the dignity of someone who has long since learned not to break in public. One letter after another, the story unfolded like a map of unshared emotions. Love, despair, longing. Magda closed her eyes as she reached the last one. Her breath grew ragged, her fists clenched over her skirt, holding back the cry that welled in her chest. She didn't know how much time had passed. The firewood crackled faintly in the hearth. Outside, the mist condensed against the window glass. Eric arrived shortly after. He entered without knocking, with the ease of someone unaware of the storm that awaited him. He stopped when he saw her sitting before the fire, her eyes lit not by the flame's reflection, but by the fury that burns when truth arrives too late. "They were found," she said, voice restrained, not looking at him. "All of them, every one of your letters." Eric frowned. He stepped toward the table and saw the opened bundle. "I didn't know they were still there," he murmured, genuinely confused. "And you tell me that now?" she asked, voice low but sharp as steel. "After telling me you couldn't write, after swearing there was no way to contact me." He lowered his gaze, defeated. "It wasn't easy. I had no certainty. Keeping them was my way of not giving up." "Not giving up," she repeated with a bitter laugh. "And what do you know about the wear of waiting? About the emptiness of the years spent wondering whether you were forgotten or simply ignored?" Eric stepped forward, but she raised her hand to stop him. "Don't lie to me anymore. I don't need excuses. I just wanted to know if I ever existed beyond your memory." "Magda," he whispered, "you never stopped existing in me." "Then your actions say otherwise." She rose carefully. She gathered the letters with precision and placed them back into the box. Then she turned her gaze to the plans spread out on the table. "I can't continue building the Freya, not like this, not under these conditions." Eric stepped back. The pain in his eyes was evident. "Are you canceling the project?" "No," she replied firmly. "I'm pausing it, until I understand whether I can move forward without betraying myself." Silence returned, colder now, deeper, the kind of silence that can't be broken with words because no words are enough. Eric bowed his head and left without protest. Magda, alone by the fire, stroked the lid of the box with almost ritual slowness. She didn't know whether those letters were comfort or punishment, but she knew one thing: from that moment on nothing would be the same. Because the truth, though late, had come to expose what neither sea, nor time, nor silence had been able to bury. The arrival of the merchant Einar cruise at the port of Aarhus didn't cause much stir at first. He was a burly man, thick-bearded, with calloused hands forged by years on maritime routes. He had come from Copenhagen in search of quality timber for the construction of lightweight vessels, and everyone knew he was willing to pay well. He dressed decently but without excess, and had a deep voice that filled any room, even when he was simply ordering a mug of beer. At the inn near the dock, rumors wove themselves like invisible threads among the regulars seated on wooden benches, surrounded by the dense aroma of fried fish and toasted bread. It was there that, glancing toward a group of shipyard workers, Einar saw him. He saw him and recognized him. "Olaf Bergstrom," he asked, slamming his mug onto the table. "By all the heavens, is that you?" The voice, loud and unmistakable, echoed off the tavern walls and hit Eric like thunder. Conversation ceased at once. All eyes turned toward him, brimming with surprise, doubt, and a barely contained tension. Eric froze for a second. Then slowly he turned toward the man. "You're mistaken," he said, forcing calm. "I'm not that person." "Don't lie to me," Einar shot back, louder. "I saw you in Gothenburg years ago. You were with a mixed-race boy running from the Navy. Everyone knew you were hiding. There was even talk of a bounty on your head." Eric didn't respond. He simply grabbed his coat and left the tavern without looking back, but the words had already taken root. Within hours, the entire port was whispering. The names varied, but the rumors didn't. They said Captain Dahl wasn't a real captain at all, that his real name was Bergstrom, a fugitive with a shady past involved in slave trading or smuggling in the Antilles. The details shifted, but they all agreed there was something dark behind those gray eyes. Klaus heard the rumors with a deepening scowl. Jonas, on the other hand, said nothing. His silence hung heavy, like the smoke of a chimney long overdue for cleaning. From the gallery of her home, Magda watched the comings and goings of the shipyard without intervening. The box of letters still rested on her desk, closed, but each word inside it weighed more than the wood that encased them. That night the air carried a bitter dampness, a mix of salt, mist, and something else, suspicion. Eric went to Magda's house unannounced. He knew he had to face her. She greeted him standing without inviting him to sit. She wore a dark blue wool dress, her hair pulled back with severity. She didn't raise her voice, but her gaze alone could cut through any lie. "Who is Olaf Bergstrom?" Eric lowered his eyes, for once speechless. It took him a moment to answer. When he did, his voice was low, heavy, and lined with genuine shame. "I was that name," he said. "For a time after escaping the colonies, I couldn't use my own. There were charges against me, false ones, but enough to imprison me for life. I changed my name, my face, my roots, everything. I had to protect Jonas." Magda didn't flinch. She only pressed her lips together. Protect him from what? From the truth? From his right to know who his father really was. "From the men who wanted to punish me through him," Eric replied, eyes fixed on the floor. "Men who thought I owed them money, secrets. I wanted him to grow up without carrying my shadow." "And so you raised him on a lie," she said, her voice steady, "and left me to share in the same deception." Eric lifted his eyes, wounded. "I never lied about what I felt, about what I lived. I only omitted what I feared might destroy us." "The truth doesn't destroy," she whispered. "Cowardice does." A long silence followed. Outside, the wind rustled the poplar trees. Inside, the tension filled every corner. "I can't keep building the Freya while your name is uncertain," she said at last. "That ship carries my effort, my history, my dignity. I won't allow it to be built on shadows." "Are you breaking the pact?" he asked, his voice cracking. "I'm breaking the illusion," she answered. "The pact was with a man who no longer exists." Jonas, who had been listening from the doorway, didn't say a word. He stepped in just far enough to look his father in the eye, long and hard, and then walked away without uttering a single syllable. Eric made a move to follow him, but Magda stopped him with a single glance. "Let him go. Sometimes, the only thing you can do is allow the other person to walk away." And so, on a silent night under a starless sky, the buried truths came to the surface. The past had a name. And that name, spoken with shame, would forever alter the course of them all. The sky over Aarhus dawned shrouded in gray, like a funeral cloth stretched over the sea. The church bells rang 3 solemn times as if announcing more than just the hour. On the pier, the ships remained moored, still, as if the wind had paused out of respect, and at the Nielsen shipyard the atmosphere felt thick, heavy with glances that avoided meeting with words no one dared speak aloud. A black carriage had arrived from Copenhagen, escorted by 2 well-kept horses and a bronze crest gleaming on its door. It carried 3 representatives from the Maritime Trade Council and the district's official notary. This was no courtesy visit. Rumors spread through the town that a man with an uncertain identity had signed documents under a false name, that his presence compromised the legality of the most respected shipyard on the port, that if everything was proven, Mrs. Nielsen would lose not only her reputation, but her livelihood. Magda stood beside the gallery of the main office. She wore a light gray wool frock coat, simple, elegant, with the collar raised. Her hair was tightly pinned, her face composed. She didn't show fear, but those who knew her well could tell the tension ran down her back like a drop of icy water. Eric arrived a few minutes later, walking among workers who discreetly stepped aside as he passed. His hair was tied back with a dark ribbon, and he wore his best white shirt beneath a navy blue vest. He carried the bearing of a captain, but the expression of a man about to be cast into the sea with no boat, no oar. The hearing was held outdoors, in the loading yard of the shipyard, under the supervision of a scribe, a magistrate, and 2 stone-faced inspectors. Townsfolk began to arrive without being summoned, some out of curiosity, others out of concern, and a few out of solidarity. The silence that settled over the scene was so deep that even the lapping of the sea against the pier sounded distant. The magistrate opened the session with a ceremonious tone. "We are here to clarify the legality of documents signed by Mr. Eric Dahl, also known as Olaf Bergstrom, and to determine whether there was identity fraud, forgery, or intent to harm local commerce. Likewise, we will assess whether Mrs. Magda Nielsen's shipyard operates under any irregularities that might compromise its legitimacy." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Magda held her gaze unblinking. The scribe laid out a series of papers on the table, contracts, applications, port permits signed by Eric over the past months. All bore the name Eric Dahl, and now each signature was under scrutiny. "Mr. Dahl," said the magistrate, "can you explain your legal situation and why you adopted a different name than the one registered in the Crown's records?" Eric stepped forward with steady steps. He paused before speaking. When he did, his voice was clear, unwavering. "My birth name is Eric Dahl. In the colonies, after being unjustly taken prisoner and enslaved, I was forced to escape. To protect my life and my son's, I took the name Olaf Bergstrom. I did not do so to defraud or deceive. I did it because I had no other way to survive." The notary raised an eyebrow. "Then why did you not correct the documentation upon your return?" "Because I didn't know if I could, because I didn't know if I'd survive the judgment of my past, and because I feared that this, precisely this, would happen." The magistrate studied him for a long moment, then turned to Magda. "Mrs. Nielsen, were you aware of this situation?" "I learned of it recently," she replied, her voice serene but firm, "and that was enough for me to temporarily suspend our professional collaboration. But this shipyard has operated under my name, my decisions, and my labor for over a decade. No document, real or forged, can erase that." A dry laugh rang out from the crowd. It was Halberg, the merchant who had spoken ill of her weeks earlier. "And what assures us you didn't sign those documents to cover for him?" he said with a mocking tone. "A woman alone, always looking for shelter where she can't stand on her own." Before the silence could erupt into scandal, Klaus Mikkelsen stepped forward, slowly but decisively. He removed his cap, held it to his chest, and raised his voice with a dignity that commanded respect. "This shipyard stands on the hands of a woman, and I say that as someone who's worked here since Harold Nielsen drove the first nail. Since the day he left, she has led it. She drew the plans, paid every wage. I don't know much about laws, but I know wood, and there isn't a single beam in this place that hasn't been laid under her watch." Klaus's words rang out like hammer blows. No one dared contradict him. Then, from the edge of the crowd, Jonas crossed the yard. He walked slowly, shoulders squared, each step marking his resolve. He stopped in front of the magistrate, and without asking permission, he spoke. "My name is Jonas, son of Eric Dahl. I have no papers to prove it. No noble blood, no registered lineage, but I've lived under his shadow, carried his silence, and I've seen his regret. This man is no criminal, he's a survivor. What he did to protect me. Maybe it wasn't the right thing, but it was the only thing he could do." Then he turned to Magda. His tone softened, deeper, more personal. "And this woman, she's the first person who gave me a place where I could feel worthy. She looked at me without prejudice. She demanded everything from me, and she made me feel like I wasn't a mistake. If that isn't authority, then I don't know what is." The silence that followed was one that transforms. The officials took note. The magistrate leaned toward the scribe and whispered something. The scribe nodded. Then the magistrate looked up. "We have heard the testimonies. There is insufficient evidence to press criminal charges against Mr. Dahl, nor to invalidate the operation of the Nielsen shipyard. However, we recommend the immediate regularization of all pending documentation." The resolution was read aloud, sealed, and signed. But beyond legality, what was affirmed that day was something far deeper. The public recognition that neither silence nor suspicion, nor a hidden past could erase what was visible to those who truly see. Magda didn't smile, but when she looked at Jonas, her eyes welled ever so slightly, and when her gaze met Eric's, there was no reproach. Only quiet understanding. As if, for the first time, everything left unsaid had finally begun to find its place. The morning rose wrapped in a gentle clarity, as if the sky had been washed clean by night's tears. The wind was calm, and the sea, still as a sleeping animal, reflected the anchored masts with the sharpness of an old mirror, for a brief moment, or who seemed suspended in time, and the Nielsen shipyard began to beat again with the rhythm so hard won after weeks of uncertainty. The official ruling had arrived 2 days earlier. The shipyard's legality had been confirmed, and the Freya could be launched. The news wasn't met with cheers or toasts, but with a quietness that spoke of relief, of exhaustion, and of a wound still open, unsure of how to heal. Eric spent his hours in silence, finishing the final adjustments on the ship's stern. His hands were precise, as if working to avoid thinking, to avoid feeling. He hadn't approached Magda in days, nor spoken to Jonas beyond what was strictly necessary. He had come to understand that the most dignified thing, perhaps, was to leave. Not out of cowardice, but out of respect. He had done more harm than he realized, and he no longer felt entitled to occupy a space that had been earned by others in his absence. Jonas, for his part, drifted among ropes, tools, and rigging with eyes lit by restrained sorrow. He had defended his father, yes, but that wasn't enough to rebuild years of silence, of distance, of loneliness. It wasn't just what had been lost that hurt. It was what he had only just begun to discover, and which now threatened to slip away again. Magda watched everything from the gallery, like someone watching a ship drift away before the mooring lines had even been released. She said nothing, she didn't intervene, but inside her something stirred with force. She had weathered worse storms, but none so silent as this fracture opening between the three of them. At dusk, Klaus informed her that the Freya would be launched the next day at high tide. The announcement brought no excitement, only the certainty of an ending, or of a new beginning no one knew how to name. That night, as the harbor lanterns flickered with trembling light, Magda stayed awake at her desk. The ring herald had left her rested atop the ship's plans, a silent reminder of everything that had held her steady. Beside it, a folded sheet bore one name, Jonas. She had written it days ago, but still hadn't found the courage to give it to him. At dawn, the shipyard filled with movement. The Freya, imposing and beautiful, glowed beneath the first rays of sunlight. Its wood, polished and strong, seemed to breathe with life. The workers moved with precision, adjusting pulleys, securing ropes, preparing the ritual with a mix of reverence and routine. Eric took the helm for the last time, his face unreadable. He wore his old captain's jacket, the one he had kept for years as a talisman of the man he once was. He looked at no one, only at the horizon. Klaus approached him discreetly. "Have you made your decision?" he asked in a gravelly voice. "Yes," Eric replied without taking his eyes off the water. "I'll leave as soon as she touches the sea, quietly, no farewells." Klaus nodded with sadness, then stepped away without another word. But Jonas had heard him. From the other side of the dock, his body stiffened. He said nothing, just walked to the shed, grabbed a small leather satchel, and began preparing a smaller vessel, a rowboat with oars and a sail, just enough to get away. He didn't plan to say goodbye, not to Eric, not to Magda. The pain was unbearable, and the only escape he knew was the sea. The creaking of the dock as the boat was untied alerted Magda, who had just stepped down to the yard. She stopped when she saw him. Jonas was placing provisions, a compass, a blanket. His face was hardened by resignation. "Where are you going?" she asked gently. Jonas looked up. He said nothing, lowered his eyes, gripping the boat's edge. "Don't ask me to stay," he murmured. "I don't belong here anymore." Magda approached, step by step, without haste. When she stood before him, she looked at him with both tenderness and resolve. Her voice did not waver. "I'm not afraid of losing Eric. I already lost him once, and I learned how to live with his absence. What terrifies me is losing you. Not because you're his son, but because you're the only one who still doesn't know how much you're worth." Jonas looked at her then. His eyes burned with anger and sadness. "I don't understand any of this," he said. "I don't understand why he left, why he came back, why you're still here." "Because I chose to stay when no one asked me to," she replied. "And because you're still here, even if you can't see it yet." Magda took one more step. She hugged him, not out of desperation, but with the gentleness of someone embracing a fracture so it might stop hurting. Jonas resisted at first, but then, like a broken dam, he gave in. He rested his forehead on her shoulder and broke down. It wasn't loud crying. It was deep, ancient, as if it came from a place he didn't even know existed. Magda said nothing. She simply held him. In the distance, the Freya was successfully launched. The ropes were released and the ship touched the water with the softness of a fulfilled promise. From the deck, Eric saw them. He didn't smile, he didn't raise a hand. But his gaze grew more serene. And for the first time in a long while, he knew he was not alone. The next day's dawn arrived with a different clarity. The harbor mist had lifted, as if the night itself had decided to offer mercy to the souls who had carried the weight of judgment, silence, and doubt for weeks. The sky over Aarhus opened in soft tones, with white clouds drifting slowly above the calm Baltic waters, and a golden light touched the masts like a nameless blessing. The Nielsen shipyard, which in times past had witnessed farewells, rumor fires, and silences as thick as fog, filled that morning with expectant faces. Men, women, and children from the village began arriving early, coats buttoned up to their necks and eyes lit with a mixture of curiosity and reverence. It wasn't just the launch of a ship, it was the affirmation of a story that had refused to sink. The Freya waited in serenity, majestic in its clean structure. Its hull waxed, sails furled, and its figurehead carved in the shape of a Nordic woman, hair flowing like waves. It was a vessel that represented not only the labor of many hands, but also the scars of time and the decisions that had cost more than any storm. Magda was ready. She wore a modest dark blue wool ensemble, with a white linen blouse carefully pressed. Her hair was pinned into a firm bun. Her expression was neither solemn nor proud. It was calm, like someone who has learned that what truly matters needs no fanfare to be felt. Eric stood near the mast, leather gloves hanging from his belt, his face more composed than in recent days. His coat, dark and slightly worn at the edges, seemed to echo a farewell that needed no words. He had worked with discipline up to the final nail, but his decision to leave remained firm. He didn't want his presence to muddy a future that, though it might not include him, deserved to go on. Jonas, standing among the workers, observed every movement with focus. He wore his usual work clothes, but that day he had a clean linen kerchief tied around his neck. It wasn't a symbol visible to others, but to him it marked a shift, a quiet, private gesture that acknowledged something within him had begun to take shape. The magistrate who had confirmed the legality of the shipyard attended as a guest. With him were representatives of the Ship Carpenters Guild and 2 city merchants who had already placed bids on the Freya's maiden voyage. The ceremony was brief. Klaus Mikkelsen gave the ship's presentation with restrained pride and an emotional voice. Then, amid the murmurs of the crowd, Eric stepped up the ship's stairway. From there, with all present as witnesses, he raised his voice. For many years, I believed my time had ended, but the sea, like life, always holds room for one last journey. This ship was built by the efforts of many, but its soul belongs to one person alone. Then, without further preamble, he descended the steps and approached Magda. He handed her a small wooden plaque delicately carved. Engraved on it was the ship's name, Freya, and beneath it, in smaller letters, built under the direction of Magda Nielsen. She looked at him, and for an instant time seemed to stop. There was no smile, no tears, just an exchange of gazes that held all the words that couldn't be said aloud: gratitude, respect, nostalgia, and a tenderness so deep it nearly hurt. Magda accepted the plaque with both hands. Her voice when she spoke was both steady and warm. May this ship sail with a clear course, just as every story must when truth is honored. The applause that followed wasn't loud or raucous. It was deep, sustained, the kind that rises not from spectacle but from genuine admiration. The workers stepped forward to gather around the ship. Some shook Eric's hand. Others congratulated Magda with quiet respect, but none expected Jonas's voice to rise above the murmur. "I'm staying." Silence fell instantly. All heads turned toward him. Jonas took a step forward, chin lifted, chest squared. "I want to learn the craft. I want to stay here, if you'll allow it," he said, looking directly at Magda. She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded without speaking. That single gesture was enough to turn murmurs into smiles. Some clapped again. Klaus, standing nearby, let out a breath that barely concealed his emotion. Eric remained silent, standing near the Freya's figurehead, eyes fixed on his son, his lips curved ever so slightly. It wasn't a smile, it was something more intimate, more at peace. For the first time he understood that staying isn't always about presence. Sometimes it's about leaving something well-rooted in another's hands. The wind began to blow steadily from the north, lifting women's skirts and setting the shipyard flags fluttering. The Freya's sails, still furled, stirred lightly, as if sensing their future on the open sea. Magda stepped aboard. She walked slowly across the freshly treated wood. She placed a hand on the railing and lifted her gaze toward the horizon. There it was, the hazy line where sea and sky met, where everything could begin again. Eric watched her from below. She didn't look back, but she felt him. And he, before leaving, let his eyes follow her one last time, because he knew there would be no kiss, not yet. But in that distance filled with meaning, in that quiet they now shared, the future had already begun. A future where cracks weren't hidden, but accepted. Where the wind shifted, yes, but not to push things into forgetting. Rather, to open new routes. And so, as the Freya finally floated in the waters that had long awaited it, Aarhus bore witness to a moment of true beauty. Not because it was grand, but because it was profound. Because sometimes, love is measured in how one chooses to stay, even when they also know exactly when it's time to let go. The icy breeze from the fjord blew harsher that week. The sky, overcast for days, released a fine persistent rain that soaked the tile roofs, blackened the stone walls, and filled the air with the smell of wet wood. At the shipyard, the usual hammering had ceased. The Freya, now firmly moored at its dock, lay silent like a sleeping giant, indifferent to the voices that had once shaped it. But it wasn't the ship that had cast everyone into reverent silence. It was Erik Dahl's body, lying for 2 days in the attic bed, covered to the chest with thick blankets, his face bathed in sweat and his lips cracked from fever. Magda barely left his side. She had brought a straight-back chair and an iron brazier where a bitter herbal infusion simmered non-stop. Every few hours she moistened his lips with a cloth, changed the soaked sheets, or adjusted his torso so he could breathe more easily. The village doctor, a man of few words, had murmured that it was a chest infection, likely caught from working in the rain at the shipyard. Nothing that could be cut with a knife or stitched with thread. All they could do was wait. Magda didn't wait. She kept vigil, with a steady face, tireless hands, and increasingly weary eyes. At night she read aloud the old navigation books Erik had brought in a trunk. In the mornings she received Klaus or Jonas, who would briefly come up to ask about him. But it was she and only she who remained by the bed, watching every slight flicker of his eyelids, every incoherent murmur that escaped his fevered lips. It was during one of those early mornings, with the wind pounding the shutters, that Erik began to speak clearly through the delirium. "Naomi," he whispered, trembling, don't close the door, the men will come with chains." Magda shuddered. She leaned toward him, gently taking his hand. "Shish, you're safe, Erik. You're here in Aarhus, no one's coming," she whispered. But he didn't hear her. "Run, Naomi. Take him. Don't look back. I don't care if it all burns, just let him live," he said with sudden force, as if reliving a memory burned into his soul. Magda held her breath. The hand she was holding clenched for a moment. She looked at him intently, trying to understand. Naomi, he had never spoken that name before. Erik turned his head on the pillow and murmured, his voice breaking. She stepped in. I wanted to go back, but when I opened my eyes it was too late. Only Jonas was there, and blood, so much blood." Magda felt a sharp pain in her chest. For a moment the shipyard disappeared, the storm faded, and all that remained was the figure of a man tortured by memory, by guilt, by a debt impossible to repay. "Who was Naomi, Erik?" she whispered. But he had already sunk back into fevered sleep. Magda sat down again. The brazier crackled softly as she added another log. Outside the rain didn't let up, inside the silence was dense. She couldn't close her eyes for hours. The name of that woman, Naomi, hammered in her mind. She was Jonas's mother, no doubt. The woman the boy knew nothing about, except that she had died on the islands. But now, for the first time, a story began to form behind that emptiness. Naomi hadn't been a shadow. She had been a protector, a companion, a martyr. Magda stood slowly, went to the dresser and lit a candle. She took a bowl of clean water and brought it to the bed. With steady hands she cleaned Erik's face, slowly bringing down the fever. He sighed, as if his body recognized her touch even in delirium. The pendulum clock struck 3 in the morning. The house creaked in the wind, but she didn't move. She just watched him, studied every line of his face, the unkempt beard, the wrinkles etched by the sea and the years without mercy. And, unable to help it, she remembered the night he left. She remembered his words, his promises, his kiss in the rain. She remembered the fury of the first years, the resignation of the following ones, and the sting she had felt upon seeing him return, as if time could retrace its steps. But it couldn't. Erik wasn't the same. Neither was she. And yet there they were, united by the same lit candle, by the same shared silences, by the boy sleeping in the room below who, without knowing it, was witness to a story still beating. Magda leaned in. There was no intention, no calculation. It was simply the weight of all they had lived, all they had kept silent, all they had endured. She leaned over him and pressed her lips to his forehead with a tenderness that burned. And then, as if the gesture opened a crack in the delirium, Erik slowly opened his eyes, with difficulty. She froze. His tired, watery eyes searched for her. "Magda," he whispered. She didn't answer. A tear slid down Erik's temple. It wasn't a tear of pain. It was an old tear, the kind born when the soul finally stops fighting its own story. Magda took his hand, squeezed it gently. They said nothing more. Outside, the rain began to ease, and inside the house dawn timidly crept through the slats of the window, as if the world at last had stopped for a moment to hear the whisper of redemption. It had been a year since the night the fever took hold of Eric's body and nearly dragged him away. A year since Magda, with steady hands and a trembling heart, kept vigil through every dawn at his bedside, amidst whispered fragments of a past that had finally dared to reveal itself. And though the calendar marked the passing days, life had moved on in a quieter, more deliberate way, like someone mending a torn sail with fine thread, not in haste but with purpose. The Nielsen shipyard was no longer the same. Its walls, carefully restored, had been painted white with deep blue trim. Large windows now let in the fjord's light, and each morning the wooden planks creaked beneath the boots of young men training under new leadership. The Freya, majestic and still, was moored at the same dock where Eric once dreamed of setting sail again. But it was no longer a dream of escape. It had become a symbol of staying, of legacy. Its sails, strong and furled, now awaited the choices of a new crew, and at their helm, chin held high and gaze steadier than ever, stood Jonas. He wore the first officer's jacket with dignity and ease. The blue coat with silver embroidery did not hide his weathered hands or the determination in his face. The young man who once arrived in town with guarded eyes now greeted workers respectfully, logged entries in navigation books, and managed shifts with precision. He was no longer just a sailor. He was an heir, not by blood but by something deeper, commitment. Klaus, now carrying the weight of his years in his shoulders, still visited the shipyard every morning. But he no longer climbed the beams or wielded the chisel. His role now was to watch, to offer quiet advice, and to sit by the tool bench with his cap tilted. He had started assembling a small chest where he stored his most prized instruments. A bronze square, a hammer with a polished handle, an iron compass. Each one carried its own history, its own share of mistakes and triumphs. And that morning, with the sun glinting off the water, he decided the time had come. Jonas walked over and stood in front of him. "Are you sure?" he asked. Klaus nodded. "The shipyard needs young hands, but more than that, it needs memory. Every tool I give you has failed at least once. That's what makes them twice as valuable." Jonas smiled, and for a moment the old man's eyes gleamed like they had in his youth. In the house next to the shipyard, the windows remained open. White curtains danced with the breeze, and the scent of freshly baked bread drifted from the kitchen. Magda walked barefoot across the polished floor, her hair pulled back in a simple braid, her apron tied at the waist. Her expression, though calm, carried the weight of everything she had lived through. Sometimes, in the stillness of midday, she would pause and watch Eric by the window, reading an old navigation book or tracing routes on maps he would no longer follow. Eric had aged. Not in body, still strong, but in his eyes. There was no urgency in his movements, no shadow in his words, just a peace that only comes after forgiveness. He had made peace with the sea, with his past, and most importantly, with himself. Though he no longer climbed masts or gripped the helm, his presence at the shipyard was respected like that of a lighthouse, unchanging yet guiding. That particular day, the dock had filled earlier than usual. The reason was the arrival of a new apprentice, a young woman named Ellen, daughter of fishermen, who had shown an innate talent for ship carpentry. She was only 17, but already measured with precision, marked with chalk, and sanded wood with a determination that caught everyone off guard. Magda watched her from the porch. She said nothing, just nodded with quiet approval. Seeing a young woman at the workbench, where only men once stood, felt like a small, silent victory, not out of pride but out of justice. By evening, the sky turned shades of amber and mauve. Gulls circled above the water, and the church bells rang in the distance. That's when Magda slowly walked to the dock, a knitted shawl draped over her shoulders, her hands folded across her chest. Eric was already there, leaning on the railing, eyes lost in the horizon. She stepped up beside him without a word. For minutes, neither of them spoke. They just watched the sea. The waves lapped gently against the dock's pillars, and the salty breeze brushed their faces. The whole town seemed to hold its breath in that moment. The voices, the footsteps, even the hum of the workshops faded. Then, Magda extended her hand. Eric took it without hesitation. He didn't grip it tightly. He simply held it with the kind of gentleness that comes when there's nothing left to prove. Their fingers, laced together, trembled slightly, not from the cold but from everything that hand now offered: companionship, forgiveness, understanding, refuge. They had reached the last harbor, not the kind that signals the end, but the kind where one lowers the sails and rests. There were no new promises, no grand declarations, just a shared truth that needed no words. And so, with the sea stretching out before them, the Freya at peace, Jonas preparing the next voyage, and Ellen carving her first mast, Magda and Eric understood that some stories don't end with a kiss or a goodbye. They end when silence is no longer something to fear, when life at last allows you simply to be. 20 years had passed since that afternoon when Magda and Eric, hands entwined and silences at peace, stood on the dock in Aarhus and gazed toward the horizon. The shipyard still stood, now a living relic among modern buildings, its structure reinforced but its spirit untouched. The Freya, after years of journeys, had become a legend. Now it rested, grounded on solid land, transformed into a museum and floating classroom, its name painted in golden letters, its wheelhouse preserved like an altar. It was autumn. Crimson leaves fell onto the cobblestones of the port, and the wind carried the scent of salt and chimney smoke. Aarhus was no longer a town of narrow glances. The arrival of women at the shipyard, of sailors from distant shores, of apprentices from different backgrounds, had slowly chipped away at the rigidity of old times. The old tongues had gone quiet or softened. Now a young woman could learn the art of ship carpentry without raising eyebrows, and a mixed-race son could lead a crew without anyone questioning the color of his skin. Jonas Dahl Nielsen was a captain. Tall, composed, his face weathered by the sun and his hair streaked with gray, he commanded his own brig, the Naomi, named in honor of the woman who protected him before he even knew what danger was. He returned to port twice a year, and each time the first place he visited was a modest grave on a hill to the north, where Klaus now rested. The man who hadn't been his father by blood but had taught him to work with dignity still guided him in every important decision. The shipyard was now under the direction of Ellen, the once restless apprentice turned master of apprentices. Her hair pinned in a high bun, her voice firm and clear, she was known for her precision and strength of character. No one matched her skill with the chisel or her accuracy in calculating a hull's resistance. She had taken Magda's place, not by inheritance but by merit. And Magda no longer climbed stairs or carried planks. She walked slowly now, using the wooden cane Eric carved for her during their last winter together. Because Eric, the captain with the deep gaze and quiet voice, had passed 5 years ago on a September morning, as he slept with his face turned toward hers. He didn't suffer, he didn't say goodbye, he simply left, with the same quiet grace with which he had returned. Magda didn't cry that day, not in public. She mourned in silence as she had lived, with a straight back, a faithful heart, and her head held high. She kept his letters, his nautical sketches, his sailor's buttons, and every afternoon she sat by the sea under the shipyard's eaves, a woven blanket over her legs, gazing toward the same spot on the horizon where once a flagless ship had appeared and changed her life. Some said she talked to herself, that she sometimes laughed softly as if someone were whispering memories into her ear. But those who knew her understood she wasn't alone. She was speaking to the wind, to time, to the man who had returned after 20 years to build her a ship and ended up building a home. Sometimes groups of schoolchildren came to visit the Freya. Magda would greet them with a smile. She would tell them the ship had been built by hand with no blueprint but memory and longing, that it had weathered storms and betrayals, but had also cradled reconciliations. And when a little girl asked if it was true that a woman had once run that shipyard in times when that seemed impossible, Magda would wink and say, "It wasn't impossible, just unimagined, but someone had to do it first." The gulls, no longer afraid of her, nested on the roof of the old workshop. Every spring they returned right on time. Magda watched them year after year and felt everything was in its place. Love had endured, not like a roaring flame, but like a warm ember that never went out. It didn't need to last a lifetime. It only needed to arrive in time to mend what had been broken. It was enough that in the end, neither of them left with empty hands. And so, as the sun sank once more into the northern sea and the wind stirred the Naomi's sails, Magda closed her eyes, not to say goodbye but to remember. Because in that land of wood, storms and ships, love didn't shipwreck. It simply took root where no one expected to find solid ground, and there at last it settled for good. Sometimes love doesn't arrive when we expect it, but when we need it the most. This story reminds us that it's never too late to forgive, to rebuild, to look at the past with compassion and to the future with hope, that even in the harshest winters a refuge can be born, and that the deepest wounds when faced with truth can become bonds that endure. Magda and Eric taught us that time doesn't always destroy, sometimes it ripens, that redemption doesn't erase the past, but gives it new meaning, and that a true home isn't always made of walls and roofs, sometimes it's simply a hand waiting for you at the dock. If this story touched your heart, tell us in the comments which part moved you most. And if you've made it this far, write the word shipyard so we know you were part of this journey to the final harbor. That helps us grow this channel more than you can imagine. And don't forget, there are more stories filled with emotion and hope waiting for you at the end of the video. Thank you for being here. Thank you for feeling with us. Because every story shared is a hug you can't see, but one that stays.